Welcome to the Brain Scrub, a somewhat improvised approach to mental health. My name is Glenn Saunders. Welcome to today's episode, and I'm going to talk about obsessive compulsive disorder, which ties into the last episode around neurodivergence. And I know this topic more now than I did before, and I can share this story as the person who I know had or still has OCD, I'm suspecting, has talked about it on his podcast, and that happens to be my son. And there are many regrets that I have in not knowing more about this earlier on in my life. And when this presented itself with my son, I did not know what to do. And if he was in front of me right now, I would say to him, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to do the best I can, which is what every parent does. OCD is apparently 7 on the top medical conditions that you don't want to have, the worst ones. And it started off, I think, the signs right when he was born. Day one, he came out and he lifted up his head. Normally you have to hold a baby's neck so it doesn't fall backwards. My son was not that. He paid attention. He looked around. He was always in tune with everything, monitoring his environment. And as time went on, other things started emerging. Like he would always cling on to these 2 plastic cows that he had. He never wanted to let them go. He would have extreme temper tantrums to a point where I would have to deal with it, because that was kind of my job in the relationship. Glenn, you deal with it. To hold him into his room until you could breathe, relax, calm down. There were other things such as always pulling up his socks when we're going for walks. He had these different mannerisms, these rituals that he kind of went through. He was afraid of vomiting for a certain period of his life. He got really emotional and angry and upset when he fell down or hurt himself, like excruciating pain. There was a lot of fear. And for me as a parent, it was frustrating. I did not know what to do. I was trying to console him, and it almost seemed like it was unconsolable. Now, what I know is for him, it was very, very painful. And that's what I had no idea about. Somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder basically has obsessive thoughts, that their brain is telling them something, that you need to do this, otherwise bad things could happen. So that's the obsession. The compulsion is the behavior that's there to avoid those thoughts. For example, you are going to get hurt if you don't do this. So then what a person who has OCD may do is they may do that compulsive behavior. And that's just one example of OCD. But it's these thought patterns, these negative thought patterns that control you, and you have to compensate by doing something. You can have therapy to deal with this. And I think the most popular one from what I'm hearing is cognitive behavioral therapy to get over this. I wish I would have known this way back when this was going on. I was lost, confused, took my son to a counselor, trying to figure out how to work with my son. And then sadly, the day he was diagnosed with OCD and ADHD was essentially the day that I lost him. Because a month later, he was no longer a key part of my life. And eventually I was alienated from my son. Told that you need to learn how to communicate with him. There was no support there for me. I didn't know what was going on, and that's it. Now, I'm not going to get into my sad story and reminisce about that kind of stuff, or ruminate rather about that. It just, what happened. And as parents, what's important now in hindsight is when we hear about this kind of thing is to then come up with a strategy collectively with the other parent around what do we do? How do we support this child? Because both my current wife and I had no idea what to do. That's why we saw a counselor. But the counselor didn't know that my son had OCD or ADHD. And she did the best she could with us. Which is going to lead me to another point that I want to talk briefly about. I was listening to a Joe Rogan episode with Abigail Shrier on it. And Abigail Shrier has written a book on therapy and the challenge therapy presents to kids. And her book is titled Bad Therapy: Why Kids Aren't Growing Up. Interesting book. Rather interesting interview. I haven't read the book. And what I got out of it, because she mentioned this near the end of the episode, was parental alienation is becoming a huge problem across North America. What they're finding is a lot of it has to do with bad therapy, which made me reflect on my journey with my son. And I'm going to share a bit of that with you, because as a parent, it's important to know that this may be happening, especially if you're in a situation where you may be divorced and you have joint custody of a child, which I had. We started going to a therapist and a counselor to understand how do we deal with my son and his behaviors. And things came up such as mutual boundaries, to listen to each other, to be on the same page, because what it comes down to is ultimately the parents are the parents and we are the authority. What's happening a lot nowadays is children are becoming the authority. What do you want? What would you like to do? Which is giving kids more of a say in the matter of how they run their life. But kids need to understand boundaries because that's not how the world works. We all have to respect boundaries, respect other people. We live in social environments. We are around others. We can't just do what we want all the time. We have to really consider the impact of our behaviors and follow the rules. If there's certain social norms or rules, they're there for a reason to keep society in order. So we can't just be all about me. We have to be about we. And that is why boundaries are so important. Now, I was never good at holding boundaries. And that impacted, for sure, the relationship with my current wife. The other challenge was just around with therapy was my ex was doing her thing and we were doing our things and we're trying to collaborate, and there was no willingness. In fact, there was complete refusal to create mutual boundaries that we both were going to adhere to. It was not to be discussed. I now get why, and I'm suspecting it's because of control. My son became dependent on my ex-wife because it was just the two of them. They had each other. They took care of each other. I had my current wife. I had a stepson. And of course, he's going to get more support and care from his mother. His mother also had a lot of fear about different things, and I experienced this throughout our relationship, and I had my issues as well. The challenge was whenever my son needed something or refused to do something, she would help him through it. And what the book also states, from what I understand and listening to the podcast, that if we're always there to helicopter in and save our kids, they're not going to learn, or they're not going to overcome their anxieties because there's somebody there to do it for them. So she talks about being over therapized, and that sometimes we just need to get into the trenches and figure things out and build that resilience versus always getting support from other people or from our parents. The story continues because what happened was my son then was going to therapy for his obsessive compulsive disorder. And as part of that, the therapist talked to me. And explained a bit about what was going on. And I said, well, here's the situation that I'm dealing with right now is my son has anxiety. He's saying he doesn't want to be with me. His mother is taking him away and saying, you know what, if you don't want to be with your dad, if he's stressing you out, we're going to remove you from the situation. And basically, when dealing with anxiety, you don't remove people from the situation. You actually expose them to the situation to let them know it is safe. But he had it in his mind that my home was unsafe. And yes, the way I handled his OCD was not correct. I didn't know what to do. I tried to console him the best I could, and there was things I could have done differently, but I didn't know that back then. And if he's listening to this, Nicholas, if he's listening to this, I apologize for that. I have regrets that I didn't know more about it, and I have regrets that I didn't stand up for myself and for you and say, you know what, we need to work together on this and move forward, rather than taking you away from the situation. So when she says in her podcast that alienation is because of bad therapy, I get where she's coming from, because when I explained that to the therapist, she said to me, that's not my job. That's up to you and your ex-wife to figure out. My job here is to have your son get over his obsessive compulsive disorder and ADHD. And she didn't bother looking at what are the parental contributions that are leading to this. And there was things on both sides that were leading to his anxiety. And that went unaddressed. I am definitely angry about that. There is so much power given to a child, and we don't generally look at what are the parents doing to enable certain behaviors, to enable anxieties. What are they bringing in? And I can speculate on what was going on with my son in his mother's house, and I know what was going on in my house. But this whole thing about being unsafe was at its core. And safety is such a huge priority. But it wasn't a real lack of safety. It was a perceived and judged lack of safety. So it wasn't factual based. However, with OCD, it's not factual based. It's the brain is telling you to do this for whatever reason. Abigail mentions that parents need the therapy first, and then we can work with the kids. So if your child is going through some sort of issues, be with that co-parent that you have. Go to therapy, discuss it, come up to an agreement. If you can't come to an agreement, then if you are separated, you may have some challenges because one parent may play off the other parent and look at what you're doing as wrong and what they're doing as right. And then the child hears this as well and notices these things. And then one parent becomes the caregiver. So my ex-wife, she was the one that did the meditation. She's the one that consoled him. She's the one that came over when things were wrong. She's the one who said, you know what, if you don't want to take the bus to school, I'll pick you up from your dad's house. All these things, flying in to save a child is not necessarily the answer. And in fact, it's causing more stress for the other parent. And it's not allowing the child to figure out, how do I live in this world on my own, and how do I resolve issues, and how do I deal with these things that are coming at me? And sadly, I don't think the therapy that my son got and that we got did that. It was all about my son, his story, and not looking at what environment is informing the stories that you're making up about your situations that you're in. And there was no willingness for the counselor to talk to me about that. And in fact, in the judicial system, when I went to court and I tried to stand up for my son, they said, sorry, your son's 13, he can make his own decisions. We are giving kids at a young age so much power, so much control, when their brain scientifically is not able to manage all that, where you're not a critical thinker, where you can't think about what's going to happen in the future, what's the impact of this, because you haven't lived a life through your adolescence and through your early adult years to understand what's going on in the world and what the consequences are. So to wrap up this episode, first of all, if your child is having some issues, it is great to go out there and understand what those are, to be diagnosed. When I think about me when I was a child, I was always worried that I had something wrong with me, that I have some sort of disease. And my parents, well, rather my mom, always said, don't worry, Glenn, everything's going to be all right. That's what somebody with OCD needs. But if you just always give them the reassurance, they're not going to get through it. So for me, it never really worked. Versus I hear that you feel this way. And what now? Versus consoling. Of course, it's important to listen. It's important to seek to understand and things like that. But once you understand the diagnosis, and too often we don't find out about OCD or ADHD or all these other neurological challenges we may have until we're between the ages of 7, 14. So it doesn't happen at a young age. The signs start coming out, but we don't get diagnosed until we're a tiny bit older. The other thing is, do you need medication? Yes or no? And just manage that accordingly, because what can happen is a medication can mask the true root cause of what's going on. And I think in a lot of cases, based on what I hear out there, a lot of it is based on the parents, how they are, the environment that they create. The other thing is get the tools, get the techniques on how to manage through this. Educate yourself once you know. For me, it was too late. I didn't find out he had OCD until just before he left me, so I was very limited in what I could do. If I would have known earlier, then I would have been able to talk to him when he said to me, you know what, Dad, my voice is telling me to do this. I just thought, there's something wrong here. We need to see a doctor. If you have a voice that's telling you to do bad things, that's not good. But I had no idea of OCD. So once you find out about something like that, to get educated, to start practicing these things with your child or whomever has OCD so that you can work with them effectively so they can heal themselves in the process and manage it accordingly. Folks, my heart goes out to my son for what he had to go through in his childhood. And I want nothing more than him to be in my life right now. And I have learned so much about the human dynamic, what people go through. It has expanded my knowledge. This whole identity shift as a father that I went through is helping me understand what other people go through and how to best support those individuals. But it's taken time. And that's the gift in all this, is a growing experience. I'm not trying to ruminate over what happened. Rather, what can I learn from this going forward and bring forth to others? So thank you for listening today, and I look forward to our next episode. Take care.